Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, wherever you are. This is an international event. Welcome to this exciting conversation that we're about to have, sponsored by KTN, the Knowledge Transfer Network, hosted by Tshimologong. My name is Kwezi Fudu Tsenenda, Enterprise Development at Tshimologong Precinct. And welcome to this amazing conversation that we are supposed to have today, talking to investors who are looking at tech-enabled and tech businesses in Africa and South Africa. And we are going to talk about what the opportunity is for our entrepreneurs, what funders are looking for, and how we marry the two. I'm going to hand over to Sophie West. She's going to tell us a little bit about KTN Global Alliance Africa and a little bit about the partners that are part of this event. And then we will hand over to Tshimologong CEO to give us a little bit about Tshimologong. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Kwezi. So just a bit of a background first, just in case you're not aware of who we are as KTN. So we are the UK's largest innovation network. So we exist to connect innovators with new partners and new opportunities beyond their existing thinking, accelerating ambitious ideas into real world solutions. We actively build communities from businesses, government, funders, researchers, and third sectors around emerging innovations and sectors to prepare markets for global opportunities and challenges ahead. Our aim as KTN is to establish a network of innovators so powerful its ideas will change the world. So the Fireside chat today is being delivered by the KTN Global Alliance Africa project, which is a 6-year project co-funded by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy through the Global Research Challenge Fund, with strategic partnership of Innovate UK. Our aim is to drive networking and knowledge exchange activities that can help foster long-lasting strategic partnerships between the UK, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, as well as wider sub-Saharan Africa. These fireside chats are the starting point for one of our key activities across the coming years, which focused on investment pipeline activities, providing both downstream and upstream support. Our team will put a link in the YouTube chat to our website where you can find more about the project more generally, as well as this intervention. Finally, I'd like to thank Kwezi and her team for organising today's session, as well as all participants as well. I really hope you enjoy the session and we look forward to working with you across the years on the project. Thank you, Kwezi.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That is Sophie West. She's the delivery lead on the Global Alliance Africa project. Now I'm going to hand over to Leslie. Leslie is the CEO of Tshimologong, and we're always so proud and within Tshimologong to be a tech hub that is led by women. And I'm excited to hand over to Leslie to do the official welcome for this event. Just to alert everybody else, thank you, Sophie, for alerting that this event is being showcased on KTN's YouTube channel. You can also hop onto Tshimologong's Facebook page and be able to see the event as well. Leslie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwezi. I'm really excited that we're gathering as an African ecosystem throughout these fireside chats. I think, there's been a lot of focus on what the work we're doing from a tech perspective in both South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. And I think, for me, this is a moment of pause to really demystify facts and fiction, or at least myths of what does it take to build a solid investable pipeline. And the reason why we can demystify it is because we are in the company of those who are actually taking the risk to do so, taking the financial risk, their hard-earned cash, that says a lot, and they're going at it. So I've got a lot of questions for a number of the panelists that I know will be addressed today. And I'm also thankful to KTN for actually enabling this moment. In the past 2 years, we've been doing quite a bit of work with our peers across the continent to look at where and how we can strengthen the Pan-African network, look at opportunities for collaboration, and especially for our entrepreneurs to scale across the continent. And it's these active, practical steps that keeps the conversation alive, but it's not conversation on its own. It's conversation that leads to action. But we need reflective action. I think, sometimes there's so much activity that we get caught up in our own noise of the buzz and the hype. But we do need to pause and reflect. Are we on the right track? I think I'm also quite keen for somebody who runs a tech precinct to understand what we should be doing better. But not only us, incubators and accelerators in South Africa, what should we be doing better? Also, what are we doing well that we need to build on, celebrate, and scale? And then also, I think it's a moment of pause for entrepreneurs to take a serious look in the mirror and be honest with yourself in terms of, are you ready to be an entrepreneur? Are you ready to be an investable business? And are you willing to adapt? I come across so many incredible inventions every single day. But sometimes, to be honest, there's arrogance, and entrepreneurs say, I don't need incubation, I don't need acceleration, I can go at this on my own. And 3 years later, you find them at the exact same place when their peers are moving on. So essentially our vision for Tshimologong is really to make sure that we are creating African world-leading digital ventures. And that is a lot, because many of us are consuming the world's technology. If you look at your cell phone, look at your smartphone, how many apps do you even have on there that's being developed in Africa? And I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of us said none. So this is really to galvanize us as an ecosystem, put in the work, understand what are the skills, what is the work need to be done, and let's stop exporting entrepreneurs who want to set up in other nations because we're not offering what they need right here at home. We have the capabilities, we have the resources. It's just about coming together and being intentional. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, KTN, and back to you, Kwezi.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you for asking some key questions. I think that's already giving our panelists, I'm sure, a lot to think about as we embark on this conversation today. I'm also excited to see that we already have questions coming from our audience, already thinking critically about what we are about to talk to today, and hopefully some of their their questions will be answered through the conversation that we have today. I think at this stage, we are about to start, I think, the most exciting part of today, and that's actually having the conversation around, the funding ecosystem in South Africa, the opportunities that entrepreneurs provide for funders, for those with deep pockets wanting to make impact. Of course, we have with us today two great and well-experienced people in the funding space, in the innovation space, and having worked with tech startups. We've got Abu from Josie Angels. I said that in my Xhosa accent. Welcome, Abu Kasim. Abu is a big friend of Tshimologong, has worked with many of the startups in our ecosystem, but I think more importantly, he's worked with many, many other startups across the world. And we're so excited to have you, Abu. Welcome. We look forward to a conversation with you. Ntate Phimelo Bahulu, how are you today? Thank you so much for making the time. Ntate Phimelo, he is from the Technology Innovation Agency, which is one of the government agencies concerned with innovation in the country and funding and supporting innovation. And one of the key reasons I want to bring in Phimelo into this conversation is that Tshimologong is a university-based incubator, so we do have an interest in what comes out of universities, and we know that TIA has also got quite a keen interest on what is happening within the university space and being able to pick up some of those inventions and turning them into innovation. So he's also a key part of this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Abu and Phimelo, and then maybe just ask you to just briefly introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and just a little bit about your companies and the kind of funding that you offer to entrepreneurs. Abu, we can start with you. We're doing this in alphabetical order. Abu, we'll start with you, and then we'll hand over to Phimelo afterwards. Please introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, Kwezi, and good afternoon to all the viewers. My name is Abu Kasim. I'm founder of Josie Angels. We're an angel investor network based in Johannesburg. We are a group of 29 angels. We've made 45 early stage investments. So these are predominantly into tech businesses. We have invested in some non-tech businesses as well, but those tend to be scalable and solutions we can potentially export to other markets. They all tend to be equity or equity-linked investments. We don't really do debt funding. And the reason for that is we want some upside in the business. Our average investment has been 700,000 Rand, with the largest investment being 5 million Rand.
Thank you, Abu. I like what you're saying about technology solutions that can be exported, and I think that's key in actually being able to scale, right, and also being able to innovate. You know, you must be able to innovate locally, but be able to export your solutions. Ndate Phemelo, I'm going to hand over to you. I get in trouble for calling people Ndates and Mes, so please stop me if I'm out of line. Phemelo, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. My name is Phemelo Baholo. Good day to everybody. I work for the organization called Technology Innovation Agency. It's a government's own ambitious project of trying to commercialize innovations, specifically in this case, technology-driven innovations. We work across all sectors of the economy at this stage, like from your bio side to agriculture, ICTs, advanced manufacturing, and so forth. And I would say we broadly cover from concept to early commercialization. So we are a multifaceted supporter of innovations. We also fund and we also invest. I'm making those two distinctions. Most of our fundings is a combination of grants or soft ROI expectations. But we also fund big projects where we anticipate that they will be taken up by serious entrepreneurs to create whatever unicorns or zebras, whatever companies they want to create. So we work a lot with, I would say, the whole ecosystem, from the universities to science councils to private companies, even the big corporates. Wherever the source of innovation comes from, we do not discriminate. Myself, I'm more focused on the ICT industry, where we have made interesting investments from microelectronics, a sector that has sort of dissipated in South Africa. We're trying to resuscitate it to your normal apps and so forth. It's really all over, but we are focused. The intention is to take ideas from concept to market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntate. And I want to pick up on a couple of things that you talked about. So you mentioned early stage, like from concept, right? And I think that's going to be the focus of the conversation in this half of this panel discussion today, is that we're going to focus on that early stage investor. The two of you sit in a position where you take the chance on the guys that are starting out. We obviously know that that's also the riskiest part, or at least the riskiest element to invest in somebody. But I think what I want to chat to you about is the fact that Africa, unfortunately, in 2020 received, our startups received the largest funding compared to the rest of the world. It went into our tech startups. I think an odds of like $700 million US. That is quite significant. And obviously, South Africa is one of 4 countries that has benefited from that funding coming into the ecosystem. So that gives us hope, right? And that tells us that there is an opportunity. What I would like to hear from our esteemed panelists is, what is the opportunity? Like, what have you been able to identify? Why do you do what you do? You've obviously identified something. Please tell us about what the opportunity is with South African entrepreneurs. And of course, if you have a view on the region, it would be interesting to hear that view as well. Maybe we'll start with Phemelo this time, and then we'll go to Abu.
Okay. Yeah. The landscape of innovation has really transitioned from the early 2000s, even the early 1990s, where it was solely focused on maybe government-pushed, government-driven through multi-programs. The national system of innovation is slowly being opened up to include everybody, the whole ecosystem. So these days we see a lot of ideas coming from everywhere. But I think where real opportunities, especially for the sector where I'm in, ICT. Artificial intelligence, to me, it's at the top. Because well, you can tie it to so-called 4IR, but to me, that is the biggest transformation that is needed by all sectors of the economy. If you look at, let's say, health sector in South Africa, even in Africa, you will find that health sector is actually one of the late adopters of advanced technologies. If you even your mining and so forth, those sectors need advanced technologies, advanced systems that would assist in many things, you know, to manage production better than yesterday. So according to me, I think AI is the real gem that everybody should be looking at. Nicely, it cuts across all sectors of the economy. And the second point is if you look at actually lockdown has demonstrated that to quite an extent, the connectivity. Even though some countries, some areas have good connection across the continent, we still have large pockets of society that are still underserved today, are still underconnected, and some they still cannot afford the tariffs that have been charged. So we need to think about alternative ways of creating these broadband networks, the ways that sort of challenges your traditional models, to really connect, make sure that even the person who is at the furthest, the rural or the poorest of the society, they are able to engage this modern economy as well through reliable connection. I think I'll thank you.
Thank you. Some great points raised there. And I think some of the factors that you talk about, even the inequality that we've seen in our country, I'd like to pick up on some of that as we continue the conversation. Abu, tell us what's the opportunity that you see in South Africa, and maybe you can also just put in a thought around whether or not you think there is actual innovation. Are we innovating?
Okay, yeah, for me, I'm doing this really for four main reasons. I think firstly, we're seeing the ecosystem and the space that we're operating in mature. And we've seen this through companies like Luno. This is a Bitcoin and cryptocurrency exchange that was recently bought out, or they had investors in the business, and those investors were bought out by an American organization. We've seen increased corporate activity. Last year, there was a business called Bottles, which was an on-demand delivery service, which was bought out by Pick n Pay. So there's a lot of people internationally and locally who are starting to get more involved in this space. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, I think as an investor, you're in it to make money. And for me, I'm operating in the early stage investor space. And essentially, if you look at our funding landscape, the later stage guys, the guys that are going to follow on from me, there's a wealth of funding available there. So the VC segment is actually sitting with lots of money. But unfortunately, to unlock that money, you need to be a bit further along. And I'm supplying into that market effectively. So if it was described as a value chain, I'm supplying a product into a market where there's huge demand for what I'm offering. So that's the commercial reason behind what I'm doing. And then the third reason is really, I love being around entrepreneurs. I think angel investing is an extension of entrepreneurship. A colleague, David Rose, who runs New York Angels, once described it as grandparenting. And effectively, as a grandparent, you get all the joys of having the kids, but then you can give them back to their parents when it comes to all the hard work. And then, I think lastly, we're starting to see a lot of local talent actually realize that entrepreneurship is a viable career opportunity. And I think that skills element is something that we've been missing for a long time. So the more skilled people we get into this space, ultimately the better the solutions. So those are the four big reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. To answer your question around innovation, I think we can always do with a bit more innovation. My advice to all entrepreneurs is begin with that problem in mind, understand where the pain points are in the market that you're servicing, not the solutions. Often entrepreneurs, I think this is an inherent mindset or process within entrepreneurship. We often skip to that solution very quickly and then try and reverse engineer the problem. Start with the problem and then work your way towards a solution. And so often been said that you need to fall in love with the problem and not the solution. So solve that problem and don't be too connected, too fixed on that solution.
It's actually so interesting because my very next question is going to be around that, right? Data-led solutions. I know in our space, we find that we have to do that working back a lot, where somebody saw a problem, they thought, hey, I know how I can solve this problem. They develop a solution, put a lot of money towards it. And then years later, it's just not picking up, which then goes to say that there's clearly a disconnect, right, between the supply and the demand. And I'd like to have a conversation, to just hear your views around, and Abu, you touched on it, right, around the working backwards. Is it a trend that South African innovators or entrepreneurs are not looking at data-led solutions? And I think also what we want to talk about is that, are there spaces and systems easily available to the average entrepreneur on the street to know that they should be developing strategies, I guess, for solutions for products based on data? Maybe Phemelo will speak to you and we can hear about the experience that you guys are having at TIA. Are you also finding yourselves having to work back? Is there anything that TIA is doing to try and help with, the early development of these solutions to ensure that they are seeped in the data coming from the market as they're being developed?
Do you want to start? So I'll kick it off.
Please kick it off, yes. I think Phemelo might have a connectivity problem.
In terms of innovation, I think that innovation is really a function of your frame of reference. And often the starting point for that idea that you're going to explore is often someone you've seen in a similar space or in a space that you like, who's been effective and successful in what they're doing. And you want to go about replicating what they're doing. Those Me Too solutions, unfortunately, are a bit too common in our ecosystem, and we need to look elsewhere. And incubation hubs, co-working spaces, these are really the grounds that help you develop those foundational elements in your business, help you understand and see your business from different angles, help you stress test some of the thinking behind your business before you actually go and put money into the business and spend thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of rand on developing apps and what have you. Go and stress test it, go and speak to people who've been there, done that. They'll help you with some of the frameworks that will help you be more effective as an entrepreneur.
And in fact, it's so interesting you say that, because a lot of people come and they think their solutions are so unique and they don't want to talk about it, and hence can't get the feedback on it. And many of our entrepreneurs need to learn and be comfortable in getting feedback and critiqued on the solutions that they develop. Phemelo, I'm going to hop over to you and hear about what the experience has been within TIA.
Yeah, no, it's been a big concern for us. One of the biggest challenges of TIA is our funded companies not reaching market. So there are a lot of issues around market access. So there seem to be a lot of disjuncture between the innovations that are supported from early phase and what goes into the market. As a result, we have sort of tailor-made specific support instruments that would assist any company. If you want to pivot, we could assist you. But the key feature of that support is giving you a platform to do in-depth market validations to refine your concept. For us, it's in line with what we do, because we know that early technology development is technology. So later you need to engage what we call productization, industrialization, if it's in the bio sector, clinical trials and so forth. So we have an instrument that is growing, and the need, unfortunately, outstrips the funding resources available.
It's
Chrissy,
actually,
can I
you
just
say
add
that.
to that?
Please go
Can I
ahead.
add to that point? So I think we spoke earlier about the problem and that being the starting point of the solution. We can take actually a step further back. There's this concept of founder market fit. So essentially founders, the people behind the business that are uniquely placed, they've got an unfair advantage to go and execute on a business opportunity that the next person, the guy next door, does not have. And that's often the starting point. Do what you can execute on. I think that's my first piece of advice. And where you've got gaps in your knowledge or networks, leverage advisor, board of advisors, leverage your network, people that can then open up doors, people that can then provide you with input and feedback to cover the gaps that you might have.
I like that, because I think what it's saying is start. Because a lot of times people sit with ideas, they sit with concepts, but they don't start. And hence it never goes anywhere. Then you see somebody else having done it and you're like, but I had that idea, but it's so key to start and then, get the process going as you've started something. Thank you for that feedback. We've spoken a little bit about the solution. One of the key things that we do know that we face in South Africa, right, is inequality. And I think some of that would contribute, for example, to the founder market fit, Abu, that you referred to. It would also influence things like knowing how to engage with the innovation process because of what you've been exposed to. But it's also little things like knowing that if somebody's offering to help you, if you're going to cancel a meeting, don't say as it starts that I'm not coming or just not rock up, right? Like we have inequality having so many layers in our country and its effect to actually support and promote entrepreneurship, also support and promote innovation. I'd like to hear from you guys how you see, those deep effects of inequality in South Africa, which we know is rife. How do we see that coming through in our engagement with entrepreneurs, the people now? Because we do know that without the people, there is no business.
If I can come in there, from our organization side, we are aware of these issues. It's a very dicey, I think, concept. If you look at especially from the science-based innovations, historically, my organization, where it's coming from, if you look at the profile of people that get funded and so forth, it has always been a particular group of people and so forth. So we're trying to there are legislations, policies that we have put in place to address these issues. But what we are currently doing, actually, we say, let's implement even policies at various stages of a company, but don't kill the innovation, because sometimes you have a very good entrepreneur who doesn't suit your profile for empowerment, but and they can't disrupt what they are doing by bringing in, because teams, the cohesion that happens in the team, it's very important to maintain the working together. So we encourage them because it's a long journey, especially the latter phases where they start engaging further funders, that maybe they should be in transformation elements. But as an organization as well, we have introduced support at what we call grassroots innovations to explore how we could bring people who were otherwise marginally neglected, especially by the sciences as well. How do you bring such inventions, innovations, discoveries into the mainstream? Yeah, I think I'll end there for now.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of really good concepts. I mean, just the last one around the skills, right? And the science innovation being introduced early on. Those are some of the things, right, that we know our inequality contributes towards them not being balanced or in equilibrium in our society. You speak about legislation not stifling innovation. And I think that's so important. And I think it would be nice to have another conversation around these policies that are supposed to disband some of the inequality and bring more inclusivity into how the space plays out. Abu, I'll hand over to you to hear what your thoughts are on the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Pamela has talked about some of the structural elements that are in place. And we think about enterprise and supply development as key to this. A lot of institutional investors like TIA, like the SASME Fund, are putting requirements in place to try and guide investment into the previously disadvantaged businesses. So I think slowly we are starting to see a shift towards that. It is, though, a big challenge, particularly within the angel and venture capitalist space. And why I say that is because you tend to invest, and this happens naturally, it's human nature, you tend to invest in people you get along with. And you tend to get along with people that are similar to you. So unfortunately, often you're investing in people you can relate with, people you see on a similar path or similar journey as to you, maybe 5 years, 10 years back. So we are on a big drive now to educate those that were never involved in angel investing and get them up to speed on how to go about assessing businesses, how to go about doing the due diligence, and then what to do post-investment. We've got a blog on our website, and that blog follows the journey of an angel, a new angel, into the space. And the idea there is that's one education touch point that angels, and it's free to everyone, and new angels can call on and reference.
I mean, like you say that, I'm just thinking of the multitude of stokvels, for example, who are looking for value, right? They're looking for ways of investing that are more flexible, that can serve them, but the lack of education is immense. And this is not uneducated type of stokvels. This is the kind of stokvel where highly educated people are part of, contributing massive amounts into. But yet, when it comes to understanding the opportunities available to invest, but also how to assess those for investment, the education gap is actually quite big. And I think that's a massive, massive opportunity that I think there's an opportunity with both private and public sector to address. Now, speaking to instruments for investing, right? So, I mean, there's a whole spectrum, right? So you have the angel investor. You guys tend to be a little bit more flexible, probably take a little bit more of a human approach to things, as opposed to some of the government institutions where there are certain checkboxes that are important, because, there's accountability, governance is very important. And along the spectrum, some people can play and others just cannot play. And I'm just thinking, in terms of the instruments we have available for us to support entrepreneurs. So earlier we spoke about grants. There is funding, in the form of investment, either equity or debt, and everything in between, right? The innovation in the funding instruments. That's what I'm interested in having a conversation about, because, government, for example, the list is long in terms of entities that one can find funding in. But accessing that is sometimes an absolute mission, because then you are required all these documents that just make it so difficult for you to access. And then you have the venture capitalist, on the other hand, who's looking for a 10 times return, which, you might not be able to be able to show at the time. And I'm just thinking, what opportunity is there for more innovative ways of funding entrepreneurs, particularly in a space where not everybody fits into that institutional mode. And for example, stokvels have become one way where people have been able to invest their money without being bogged down by the normal institutional barriers. And I'd like to hand over to you. It might not be the exact instruments that you can speak to, but maybe elements that some of these funding instruments should be considering in order to be more inclusive of the potential of the country?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the history of the venture capital industry, they started off as debt-based, but what they found was that no matter what interest rate they charged, they could never make up for the bad debts that they were unfortunately incurring because of the risky nature of this business. So they then switched over to equity, and typically this was a straight equity deal in the past. We have seen more recently some innovations around hybrid instruments. So a hybrid is a convertible note, for example, is a hybrid instrument. And essentially that's a debt instrument that converts to equity at some point in the future. We've seen SAFE agreements. SAFE is simple agreement for future equity. And that essentially is a gift in essence, up until you hit certain landmarks or certain milestones, and then it converts to equity. We are seeing a lot of venture capitalists now starting to adopt revenue-based investment or a form thereof. And essentially, there are clauses within an RBI, a revenue-based investment, where for repayments, with each repayment, the call on the equity component of that business is reduced. So let's say we start off and I invest R1 million into your business. Typically that would be, well, let's say 20% of equity in the business. As you start repaying that RBI, that 20% then gets smaller and smaller. And in so doing, I gain some return back, but then you're not selling all that much equity, and your cap table, I guess, is more manageable in return. Kwesi, on mute.
Thank you, and the confidence with which I speak, even when I'm on mute. Phemelo, please, if you can tell us a little bit about funding instruments, the innovation around that is coming up within TIA. Anything different that we're picking up or we should be expecting?
No, from our side, because of regulations, I think we are a bit stiff. We used to take equity. We no longer have been allowed to take equity because it complicates compliance, because you have to comply. The company you need to fund must comply to PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act in South Africa. So but what is interesting with TIA money, and besides the grants, because our money is not really free, we expect, it's called levy-based funding, where it's a risk funding as well, where when you are in the market, when you start making money, we expect you to pay back, they say, some the ROI expectations that would negotiate with you. But what is interesting, that works out to be always cheaper than the money that you'll get out there from the banks and VC firms and so forth. But where it gets easy for tech entrepreneurs is that because we know that innovation can be quite a complex endeavor, we allow room for failure. So when they fail, we do not demand a payback. So we can write off after we have convinced ourselves that this is a deadlock. The IP, the intellectual property, cannot even be recycled. So we easily end it there. But when they make money, we want them to pay back. To accommodate, let's say, the type of entrepreneurs, we have also started playing around with what we call small funding. It's very small, 50,000, 100,000, 250, and so forth, to assist, because sometimes people get stuck, not because of big needs, but is to just address, there could be a very small barrier that could delay you for 6 months, even for a year. So we have opened up to such interventions as well. In those cases, we would say to you, when you commercialize, whenever you commercialize, we would expect some multiples of returns to TIA until you cover what we gave you. than using time value of money. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running out of time. I think we have another 5 minutes, and then we'll jump over to our Q&A. Thank you to everybody who has been putting in the questions in our YouTube, as well as Tshimologong's Facebook pages. I think, Phemelo, a question that has been asked, and I think I'll pick it up now because you did allude to it. A direct question: does the South African government still insist on taking IP? And I think it's a possible yes or no answer. I don't know if there is any explanation to it. And I think maybe Abu, before we jump onto my next question, which I'd like to hear from both of you, maybe you can tell us, and I think I asked this question to you because you're not legislated necessarily in how you decide to make investments, is how intentional is investing in women? I guess from a Josie Angel's perspective, and what trends are you seeing? Because the trend that we do see is that South African women are highly entrepreneurial. So at the small business stage, there is massive, they actually, more businesses from women are registered than ones from men. However, you find that as we become bigger, the number of women's businesses dwindles and dwindles. So I think I'd like to have a conversation maybe with you, or Abu, you can answer after Phemelo responds to us on the IP question, how intentional you are about investing in women, and maybe what trends you see and what women could possibly be doing to be able to eat more of this funding pie. Phemelo, I'll hand over to you.
Okay. I think there is a misconception about they call it the IPR Act in South Africa. It's the Intellectual Property Rights Management Act. I'm not sure where this misconception emanates from, but I think it comes from the old early phases of this legislation. Government does not demand your IP. It actually says your IP is your IP and nobody should take it, even if when we write you off, we don't take your IP. But what you need to do is for cross-border management of IP, just notify government that I am exporting or importing IP. That's all, but it doesn't talk about seizure at all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Abu? Thanks.
Yeah, because it's a great question, and I think it's actually a global problem. So there was an organization in the US called Mass Challenge. They did research along with BCG, the consulting firm, and they researched over 1,500 startups in the US. And what they found was that women raised less capital, but actually made more revenue on average than their male counterparts. So I think if you translate that, they probably are better entrepreneurs. And I think this relates to an ability to develop empathy with the market that you're targeting. At Josie Angels, we've invested in a number of women-led startups. There is no firm rule against or a firm initiative to try and increase that. We try and remain as objective as possible, but as and when we see opportunities that are run by women, we have invested them in the past.
Thank you, Abu. Okay, so because we're running out of time, I'm going to hop the questions over between the two of you. So, Phemelo, please tell us, what own goals do you see entrepreneurs scoring that inhibit them from actually accessing finance? And then maybe, Abu, you can tell us the key things that you would advise entrepreneurs to start doing, one, in order to access, or at least to make themselves ready to access funding, because one of the questions that came through is, when should someone start thinking about accessing funders or accessing funding? And then two, how do you prepare yourself to be investor ready? So Phemelo, tell us what are the own goals? What are the things that entrepreneurs are doing to themselves that inhibits the access to funding? I think Phemelo might be struggling there. Maybe Abu, you can start telling us. We want to come up with solutions today. So maybe some solutions around how does one make themselves investor ready, and when does one start trying to access investors or funders?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to think of this as a relationship and not a funding application. So to start that relationship a lot earlier than you actually would normally have. Often, and something I mentioned earlier, that people invest in people they can relate to, people they know, people they like. Begin that relationship early on. Establish that relationship 3-6 months before you actually go to that person to ask for funding. Hopefully that relationship will then have evolved from the very outset. So often it's a case of getting onto LinkedIn, it's a case of getting onto email, asking that person for advice initially, getting some input, perhaps asking that person to be your mentor. And then the next step in that evolution is part of your advisory board. Let that person get to know you as a person, let that person get to know you as an executor. And then on the back of that, when the funding is eventually needed, it tends to flow a lot easier. So that would be my biggest piece of advice for any entrepreneur looking for funding.
So what I'm hearing you say, it's relationships, 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 right? Which I guess is also the difference between somebody who's known or somebody in your circles. So having good networks is actually key in terms of one being able to access those relationships. I mean, to access good relationships in order to access funding. Phemelo is trying to get back on. He did have some funding issues. He had some connection issues. Phemelo, welcome back to the session.
Thank you.
If you can please just give us a few own goals or a few mistakes that you see entrepreneurs committing, and that was standing in between them and accessing funding.
From the bulk of the projects that we fund, I think one of the biggest issues is not securing your early adopters very early, even at concept phase. Because there's a lot of uncertainty around your, especially market issues, what we always push them to do is get your validators very early. People that can, so we have adopted sort of an iterative type of development where at every milestone, your customer has to give you real feedback, all the way from post-prototype or MVP to a point where you can start doing commercial demonstrations. It's an approach that is starting to bear fruits, and I think it's starting to work well. Where most of the guys fail is they come with good concepts, then you start asking them, but who is gonna buy this thing? Who's gonna use this thing? Did you secure even early intentions, without necessarily signing any agreements, would be very useful. Thanks.
Thank you. So at this stage, I think we'll start picking up some of the questions that have come through our panelists. Some of those questions we have put out, and I think they have been addressed. Some of them, the issues around IP, for example, the issues around women. There was another issue around Black people that Josie Angels has funded. And of course, the issues around mistakes. So I hope those that posed those questions are at least content that their questions have been addressed. One of the questions that have come through, it's asking the question, what do you feel is lacking in the South African innovation or tech ecosystem? What's lacking?
Can I come in there?
Please.
Yeah, I think what I've observed from where I'm sitting, because I'm at a vantage point, I see a lot of these innovations, and unfortunately, majority of them we kind of like reject. I think the guys don't do enough research. They don't research. They don't look at what's out there and why are companies that they're gonna play in the similar market with, what's making them succeed, and what will make them even better than those companies. So there's a lot of early research that is required, market research, understanding your competitors in depth. I think that's what's missing. And also, I think it's broadly issues around ideation, I think, where somebody strongly feels that their concept is unique and and it will change the whole world. But unfortunately, it's not a new thing. It's not a new concept. Yeah, so this, I think a lot of assistance required to help people to ideate better, to think better about problem formulation and how to solution for these things.
Abu, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, just to maybe include a quote on what Pamela was mentioning. There was a quote attributed to Einstein, whether he said this or not, I'm not sure, but it was said that if he was given 60 minutes to save the world, he'd spend 59 of those minutes finding out what was the reason for the world coming to an end, and then 1 minute coming up with a solution to the world coming to an end. So spend your time understanding your customer, understanding their problems, have a very deep understanding of the problem you're trying to solve before jumping to the solution. And yeah, I think to add to your question, I think the one thing it is lacking in the South African ecosystem is early adopters. So South African consumers, South African corporates are very conservative in the way they spend money. We tend to be brand loyal, and our business, we tend to support what we know. It's quite sticky business. Unfortunately, that's great for an incumbent who's getting business from you. That business tends to be sticky, and it's often not lost. But it makes life for a startup very difficult. So we don't have that risk or that ability to take on risk that you'd find elsewhere. And as a result, you're not seeing as many early adopters in this market.
I think, Abu, for you, Pamela mentioned how in his space, it's highly regulated, right? So there is very little flexibility. I think for you, who's not necessarily, I mean, you are working within this regulated space. We do know that the South African financial services space is just highly, highly regulated. But I think for me, I'd like to know from you, how does that regulation stifle or protect you as the investor?
Well, I think there are ways of getting around some of the issues. So actually, we've invested on 3 different occasions with TIA. So we've co-invested along with TIA, and we hopefully will continue to do that. So I think the one way of getting around some of the risks that you've identified from an investor's perspective is to co-invest, and there's risk sharing. And as such, I think we can get around some of the regulatory hurdles that an organization like TIA may be confined to. In terms of how regulation helps startups, I guess the entrepreneur, yeah, I think that the financial sector, as you mentioned, is highly regulated to the extent that our laws are comparable to developed markets. And yeah, I think if things were to go wrong, the laws are in place to protect the little man, the person that is not as familiar with legislation as maybe the larger companies are. So be rest assured that there's a lot of regulation around the work that we're doing, and that you are the law's on your side, effectively, as a startup.
Thank you for that, Abu. And I think that's critical to note, right? Because as much as regulation can actually enable, but it does actually, it can protect as well, which I think is what I know something that we at Tshimologong worry about at all times is, these vultures coming in for our people, and what do they want, and how are they going to take away value from them? And entrepreneurs worry about that too. So it's always good for us to be well versed in the regulation so that we can understand, what kind of role it can play in protecting or enabling us. And I think, Pimelo, as we draw close to the end of this conversation, it's like such a big topic, and I think there's so much more to delve into. I think every single theme that's come up, we could delve deeper into it because it in itself is a bigger conversation. But Pimelo, I had 2 questions that came up in my Q&A. The one is an international investor wanting to invest. An international innovator trying to get funding from TIA. Are they also subject to BEE? And the second question is, if somebody wants to access investment from TIA or funding from TIA, can they just approach TIA, or would they have to wait for an open call? And I guess that's probably thinking of how government works in relation to accessing opportunities.
Okay. The international entrepreneur has to have, the company has to be, he must find a South African partner, because we don't fund companies outside our borders. So he must make that company South African, naturalize it one way or the other. We have an open application system, so you can apply at any time. There are specific programs where calls are used, but besides that, we have an open system. You can approach it at any time.
Okay, thank you. And now the next question is really interesting because it's from one of my later panelists, Jorge, who typically would look at later stage investors. And what he wants to know is, what kind of issues do you guys who support the guys at very early stage who take on the risk, what kind of challenges do you face, or issues do you face when dealing with later stage investors? His type. I think he's trying to go through some character revitalization.
Look, for us, it's we actually, because we create a pipeline for various late stage funders. We create pipelines for VC, for angel funders, even for the likes of IDC. So we always would like to, in some cases, even co-fund with you, where there are gaps, because sometimes where we end, you'll find that there's still a gap. So the further round funders are not able to assist you. For example, you have not yet generated that first invoice. So we could come in and assist you to close those gaps. And we can agree with you to have maybe some instrument, some intervention in place. What is interesting with the companies that we funded, most of them, they run away from VCs. I don't know why. But some of them, we sometimes refuse funding to allow them to taste the cruel world out there, because that's what sort of, it makes them strong, and they can actually survive better if you don't spoon feed them. So our funding at pre-commercialization, just before full commercialization, is quite strict, because we demand a lot of things, evidence that indeed these products and services are going to be bought by the market. But most VCs, I think they love working with us at that space, especially that phase. Just that stage before you enter market fully.
All right, they want to get it nice and ready. They don't want to do that dirty work that you guys are prepared to work. But it is a value chain, an important value chain. Abu, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we tend to work together, and so there is often a negotiation process. I think of the areas that we've had issues with in the past, firstly is valuation. So often we invest in via a convertible note, which is a debt instrument which converts to equity at some point in the future, and that conversion mechanism is dependent on the valuation in future. And so we have in the past also attached valuation caps to the investment deals that we do, but there is often no valuation cap. So valuation cap is, or valuation discussions is often something that's debated. The other issue which we've had in the past is we invest via syndicates. So there are 4, 5, sometimes 6 of us that have invested in the business prior to the VC coming on board. And that often those 6 people are then shareholders in the business. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that. One of the disadvantages to that is that we may find that there is some dead equity within the cap table with a venture capitalist coming on board. And sometimes we've got to clean up that cap table before they are willing to invest.
like I said, these conversations could carry on and on and on because there's just so much and they are so deep. But we have come to the end of our first conversation. We will be taking a 10-minute break right now and then initiate another conversation at 3:10, where we will be looking at later stage investing and looking at the various issues around that, as well as opportunities. Thank you so much to Ndate Phemelo Baholo from TIA. And thank you so much, Abu, from Josie Angels. The conversation that we're having right now was about how investors are engaging with early stage entrepreneurs. We've spoken about the opportunities. We spoke about innovation. We looked at various funding instruments, speaking to own goals that entrepreneurs are making and what the opportunities are that funders can actually capitalize on. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists. Thank you everybody who joined us for this conversation. Please take a break or grab some coffee and muffins and whatever it is that makes you happy. And please join us in exactly 10 minutes to have our conversation on late stage investors. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody who's with us this afternoon. Good morning, if you are somewhere where it is morning. Welcome to this conversation being hosted by Tshimologong Precinct in Johannesburg, as well as the KTN Global Alliance Africa, KTN being the Knowledge Transfer Network. It is an absolute pleasure today to have our two panelists, Jorge and Zach, speaking to us about later stage investing. We've just concluded a conversation about 10 minutes ago on early stage investing, and now we are transitioning to the guys that take the people that are ready and start making them make big, big bucks. And we're so, so excited to have this conversation. As we kick off, I'm going to invite Zach, if you can please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, tell us where you're from, tell us your organization and what you guys do, what keeps you alive, what keeps you going. Jorge, if you can please do the same as well. Please, go ahead.
Sure. Sure thing. Thank you, Kwesi. I sort of sit in a realm in between early stage and late stage funding. There are lots of broad definitions about it, so hopefully we can call a lot of definitions by, but just defining what these are in terms of round numbers and sizes. So my very brief background is I'm an investment banker by profession. Spent about a decade on Wall Street doing mergers and acquisitions for Lehman Brothers and Barclays. Moved to South Africa in 2010 and sort of pioneered the early stage VC industry on the continent. In 2010, 2011, there was at best about $20 million of venture capital on the continent across all 54 countries. And if you fast forward that 10 years, last year alone, there was just under $2.5 billion of venture capital activity. So from a growth perspective, we're actually the fastest growing region in the world from a VC standpoint. So what I essentially have done is, prior to starting a fund, which is what I do right now, the whole premise around venture capital was you can't really invest in entrepreneurs unless you invest in the pipeline. So you need to create enterprises. So it's super important to start focusing on working with founders, to venture build together with founders, and to provide them access to not just resources and money, but also distribution channels, which is where large corporates come in. So I, together with a bunch of very smart people, we built the first corporate accelerator in Africa in 2015, which was called Barclays Tech Lab Africa, that then became Techstars. And then in late 2016, we opened up the Africa operations of Startup Bootcamp, which is one of the largest accelerators in the world. And the focus was really around how can you get entrepreneurs from all across Africa, but specifically those using technology to solve real world problems to scale from an idea and an MVP into actual serious funding. So I've angel invested in about 25 to 30 of Africa's top tech startups. I've got an accelerator fund that has a portfolio of another 25, and then I've recently launched a Pan-African seed fund called Launch Africa. So yeah, it's quite a lot on my plate, but this is a huge space, and you're seeing at a point right now the culmination of many years of innovation, starting from the universities all across the continent to building MVPs to scaling them. And we've actually seen a huge amount of exits last year. Last year was a year where there was by far the most number of exits for startups in Africa. And happy to talk about that later. So that's sort of my background.
That's that I look so forward to having picking up on some of those polls and having deeper conversations about it. Jorge, if you could please introduce yourself. Did you hear I said your name correctly?
Jorge, yeah, that's the Spanish version of George. I'm originally Colombian. Thanks for the invitation, by the way, Kwesi. I was taking notes and paying attention to what Abu and Pimelo were saying, because it's really interesting from an, let's say, outsider perspective. As I've said, I'm Colombian. I've been living in South Africa for 3.5 years now. And then I'm working with a fund which is an social impact and investment impact investment fund in London. Abu was mentioning how people with big pockets are starting noticing Africa, and some of the events during the last years have put basically Africa in the first page, not only in the landscape, but the first page of the news in terms of venture capital and investing. And I think a lot of investors know that now, and usually big money starts following the good entrepreneurs, right? So they've shown, like, deals like what happened with Paystack now in Nigeria, that there's a lot of opportunities, and that big exits are also possible in Africa. Let's say from an outside perspective, we're looking at South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt. Those are like the innovation centers. So I think there's a lot of interest from outside capital in coming here and start backing those companies. I do really believe that now with the improvement in the African ecosystem and initiatives like all the incubators and accelerators, probably as an entrepreneur, you don't need to go to Silicon Valley anymore. You can basically start your company wherever you want. And if you're good enough, the capital will start coming. Of course, there's a lot of challenges, and that's what we gonna talk about. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So Zach, Jorge says, good money follows good entrepreneurs. And I know you had put something on social media about how many of your friends left and you stayed and invested in South African entrepreneurs. Oh, African entrepreneurs, not South African entrepreneurs. What is it about the African entrepreneurs? And I think that builds on the question as to why is it that the world is seeing Africa as the opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I just think I've said this a few times before, and a lot of this sometimes goes back to psychological and also socio-cultural norms. When you invest in early stage enterprises, I know this is a late stage discussion, but it's important to understand where our deals come from. You have to take a step back and understand how the world has changed from the 80s and 90s when I grew up, and I think most of us grew up, to what happened in the late 2000s and 2010s. And one of the big shifts is, and especially those of us who are econ majors will appreciate this. So the world has always been run by producers. So if you control the factors of production, which is land, labor, capital, and resources, then you've always won. it's always been biased in favor of the people that produce things. And then something called the internet came along, and more importantly, the sharing economy and the gig economy was, introduced to the world in sort of just off of 2010. And you had this concept of reducing the amount of resources and sharing assets because the world was getting too crowded. So capex became less important than leasing, and etc. It goes on. So the purchasing power and the production power moved in favor of consumers versus producers. Now, this may sound like a philosophical argument, but it's super important to understand why businesses like Spotify and Lyft and Amazon and Dropbox are more valuable than Caterpillar or Walmart, or why a company like Tesla has a higher market cap than the next 10 largest car companies, even though Tesla produces about 1/20th the number of cars of the others combined. And it's because purchasing power of consumers and consumer behavior is a lot more important than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And that's ironically why Africa has such a huge market. So Africa was pretty much ignored for, let's say pretty much for the last couple of centuries. And 10 years ago, when mobile phones and the cost of data made consumers more relevant than producers, all of a sudden you're looking at a continent that has 1.2 billion people, and more importantly, growing quicker than any place on this planet. So Africa will account for about 1 in 3 people. So 33% of the world's population will be in Africa by the turn of the century. And you combine that with a high purchasing power, you combine that with higher penetration of mobile and internet services and the lower cost of data. And all of a sudden, everything from food security to water security to education to the distribution of healthcare to reducing the cost of transportation, you cannot just build solutions in the US or in Tel Aviv or Berlin or London when your biggest consumer market is Africa. Right? And it's because of the population growth and the increase in purchasing power. So just in the last 2 years, we've seen companies, and Jorge mentioned Paystack a while ago, and Paystack's a fantastic example. But trust me, there are companies that are significantly more valuable than Paystack that you'll hear about in the news in the next 18 to 24 months. Right? We obviously have an inside scoop in a lot of this because this is the industry, but you're going to have a huge number of unicorns coming out of Africa in the next 3 years because the consumer purchasing power is so huge here. And because a lot of funds follow consumers, as long as you have your IP and your holding company structures overseas, so in the US, which is mostly Delaware, the UK, the Netherlands, Singapore, etc., and you make sure that from a transaction and structure perspective, you're foolproof, you're going to see a lot of investment pour into content. So I suppose I had the good fortune of seeing into the future when I came here 10 years ago, but the results and fruits of that are coming in now. So, it's all about, where's your market? How do you identify your target markets? And more importantly, beyond that is, how do I reduce the cost of acquiring customers to as low as possible, whilst at the very same time optimizing for the longest lifetime value of a customer? You will see a lot of VC-backed companies good VC-backed companies don't look at metrics like EBITDA multiples or break-even time periods. They look at your LTV, your lifetime value of a customer to the cost of acquiring those customers. And Africa provides some of the best opportunities to see those metrics grow exponentially. And the good VCs are investing heavy into Africa at the moment.
Wow, that's a lot of food for thought, I think. But before we run off, I don't want to lose this question, which I think is important. You mentioned you're holding companies sitting in the US or the Netherlands. What's the value of that if the solution has been created in Africa by an African?
No, it's just literally for providing ease of comfort to investors. So think about it. If you if there are issues around moving money or transferring money or repatriation of funds, if you're incorporated in Nigeria or South Africa, that's a huge concern for investors outside that don't want currency exposure, right? I mean, you've seen how the rand went from $6 to the dollar to 19 to the dollar, 3 or 4 months ago, right? So investors can't deal with that. You can't deal with very volatile currencies, and not to mention the naira is even worse, right? So there's currency volatility. There are certain countries in Africa where the government can just take off the internet for 4 days to win an election, right? So investors can't deal with that, and rightly so. I wouldn't invest money into companies that are incorporated in Uganda or Nigeria. South Africa is probably an exception, but what I would do is invest money into a US holding company or a UK LLP or a BV in the Netherlands or a PTE in Singapore that fully owns a local subsidiary. So you're transferring the risk to a holding company overseas. The most important thing is to make sure your stakeholders are happy. So if you create jobs locally and the operating company creates all the jobs, so that's employment. The operating company in Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa or Egypt, it creates revenue, so you pay taxes locally, but the investments go into a holding company overseas. So you keep government happy, you keep employees happy, and you keep investors happy. So it's just a structural convenience. I can tell you now, I'm sure, Jorge is who has a lot of experience in late stage investing, from what I can understand. I can safely say that more than 90% of all of Africa's top technology startups are not incorporated in Africa. And that's okay. No one's losing a job or no one's not paying tax. It's just purely a structuring, just optimizing your structure. That's it.
No, thank you for that. Right. I think these are the things that you never learn at school, right? Around how to structure your company.
There are a lot of things you don't learn at school. I know this is recording on YouTube, so if this is sponsored by Pearson or any organization there are a lot of schooling is becoming increasingly relevant with every passing day. It's because a lot of content is open sourced. The best school is a school of life.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Of course, unless you do a professional degree, you would definitely want to go to a hospital where your doctor has gone to medical school. So there are exceptions like medical school, lawyers, engineers, but a lot of degrees like accounting and business and marketing are slowly becoming obsolete. So yeah.
No, thank you for that, Jorge. So Zach picked up on some of the risks of being in Africa, like our volatile governments, our volatile currencies, the instabilities that we see. But we also know that at a socioeconomic level, we've got a lot of problems in Africa. And I guess as an impact investor, this might pose an opportunity for you, or could pose an opportunity for you. I'd like to hear from you where you see some of the opportunity in Africa as an outsider looking in addition to what Zach has already mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think as we've said, there's a lot of interest now from the big corporations around, the SDGs from United Nations, and how to help change and improve the world we live in, right? So I do think in Africa there's a lot of opportunities for the local entrepreneurs, because no one really knows the problems better than someone that has grown up here and has lived here. It's just interesting to hear sometimes people talking in Zurich or London about bringing some sort of technology to Africa, where I'm not an expert in Africa, but I've been here for 3 years. I've been to a township. I know what are the issues that people experience every day of, not having electricity, load shedding, expensive internet. So all of those problems from an outside perspective, sitting in San Francisco or Zurich or whatever the big money is, are hard to understand from that perspective. So I really think you need someone like Zach, for example. You said you've been here for 10 years now. So you understand the whole African system and how it works and what's an opportunity here that is maybe not an opportunity somewhere else. What are the challenges and advantages and disadvantages? So I think that's where the opportunity lays for the local entrepreneurs, because they are the ones who know how people live here. They are the ones who know what are challenges in this typical emerging countries. I do find a lot of the problems we have and the challenges we have very similar in South America, for example. We have problems with logistics because of infrastructure. We have problems with infrastructure itself, like our electric grid it's pretty bad. And that's where you see also the opportunities. For example, now we are focused in smart agriculture and also renewable energies. We've seen a lot of companies around solar, of course, last mile distribution of solar and financing solar equipment. I think there's obviously that's a sector with like a lot of social impact, and that's what we're looking for. But we do really this is very useful for me, because I've been just listening to we're not planning to invest in idea and concept companies. That's what guys like Abu and Pomelo and maybe Zach even, you guys are investing in that early stage in sort of de-risking those companies, because you have more experience here. You know the whole ecosystem, right? So we come at a later stage, and I think there's going to be a lot of those players coming here now. I've heard about Knife Capital opening like a Series B fund. So there is a gap in that next level. And as Zach mentioned, there might be big companies and unicorns coming out of Africa, and that's where you need that extra capital. But of course, that's part of working together with the guys who've been here from the beginning and know what can be a scalable solution and what is not, right?
Cool. So before we start talking to actual money and funding instruments, I think it's worth speaking to team. We know that without a winning team, the sustainability of that entity is, it can be minimal, or at least it will be very risky, rocky, volatile. Please talk to us. What are some of the, features of a winning team? And I imagine that at the stage that you're looking at investing into some of these startups, you are expecting that certain things should have been addressed by then. And this is your expectation of a winning team, because they should be at least at a certain level of maturity where the team formation has happened, and it's providing a level of stability. Please speak to us about what in your mind is a winning team.
May I go first?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to say before I lose it, because I really agree with what you just said, Zach. Education, it's losing value. It used to be a group of like venture capital and startups used to be in the 60s, a group of buddies from Stanford and Boston and the relevant universities in the US. Now, I really think people, you can have a good team anywhere in the world, and especially around technologies. Right now, you can have all the skills you want basically with like open sources. So in terms of education, I don't think that should be excuse or some sort of exclusion because you didn't go to one of the well-known universities. Background in those terms, whether the team has whatever kind of diploma or bachelor's or whatever, it's less and less relevant. I think it's important that they can adapt to change fast, because that's what's happening all the time. And we also think we want someone who is coachable, like whoever is in charge of the team. They do need to understand that they don't know everything, and they need to have the attitude to learn and improve all the time. I think those are the two most important traits, I would say. And also I think resilience as well, you know, like they need to be able to keep trying all the time. That's what I think it's really important in a team. And just you know, if you're a founder out there and you might be a bit insecure because you say, okay, I don't have this type of background or education. I think as investors, we every time looking less and less at those things and more at what you've done. Yeah.
The man. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, listen, I think Jorge has covered most of it. I just wanted to add that I love bringing a non-financial and non-quantitative metric to evaluating entrepreneurs, because at the early stage, it's all about, your gut feel, etc. So the one thing I would say is, it's very hard to raise capital if you're a single founder. So you've got to have co-founders very early on. It's very hard to work with just one point of view. You've got to have preferably people with multiple areas of expertise, but have the ability to disagree without being disagreeable, to quote Barack Obama from his 2008 campaign. But more importantly, you've got to have founders that know the fine line between being too aggressive and being too arrogant and cocky versus being too timid and shy. So if you look at the smartest founders for African technology startups on the continent, and there are many of them, there's this beautiful quality of being confident and assertive and knowing your market exceptionally well but at the same time being humble enough to listen to your investors. Because the one thing that very few founders will accept, but is almost always true, is that your investors will likely know a lot more about your competitors in your market than you do, because you're talking to more people.
Yeah.
So if you go and talk to a startup that does digital invoice factoring in South Africa, and you say, hey, who are your competitors in Africa? They would likely not know more than 4 or 5 entities. But the reality is, people in the ecosystem, especially investors, are talking to hundreds, if not thousands, of startups every year. So you've got to be humble enough to know that you don't know everything. But at the same time, you should know your industry and the metrics better than anyone else. So you should know that if someone wakes you up at 3 a.m. and says, hey, this company has gross margins of 75%, and you should be able to say that is absolute bullshit. They're not a competitor to us, because in this industry, you can't survive on those margins. Something like that, right? I'm giving you an example. So as a founder, you really have to know your industry like the back of your hand, but at the same time, be open to getting mentored and be coachable by your investors. And founders, good founders, have the ability to make themselves dispensable, not indispensable. I give the very blasé example of Steve Jobs and how Apple continued to be an incredible company 7 years after Steve Jobs passed away. How many African companies can you think of right now that have continued to perform and soar after the key founders have passed away? There aren't a lot, right? So it is changing. So that's the one thing I would say about team. Some aspects of founders that you need to keep in mind before you invest in them.
Yeah. But I guess also, right, it's important for when we are setting up our businesses and when we're running our businesses, we're running them so that when we are not there, they can continue, right?
Of course.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to take this to you, Zach, particularly because you've been in South Africa for longer. We spoke about these people sitting in the UK or somewhere in Europe creating solutions for Africa's problems and how that's not ideal. And we sit in Joburg or Cape Town and we have solutions for running water and, lack of power and all sorts of things that we don't necessarily experience. Please speak to me about pipeline coming out of the major cities in South Africa. What experience have you had with that? And what opportunity are you seeing? And what's not being done in order to unearth whatever opportunity there is, possibly outside of the big cities, in terms of creating pipeline of good quality, innovative ideas?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I get this asked a lot is, if you come from a small town, how do you make it to the big city? Yeah. So
Or
first
how
of
do you,
all,
sorry, or how do you make it in your small town without necessarily having to go into the big city?
yeah. Yeah. So I think the one thing that I said earlier that I want to just say it again is the gateway to market access and revenue and customers is, like it or not, it's corporate South Africa from a South African perspective. So if you look at, you know, the five largest insurance companies in Africa, they're almost entirely all headquartered in South Africa. Sanlam to Old Mutual to Discovery to
In Cape Town,
Hollard, they're
yeah.
all South African companies, yeah, and they have operations all across the continent. The largest banks in Africa are all, headquartered in South Africa, from Stanbic to Barclays to, the EcoBank, which is, is a partner of Nedbank. So as an individual, you could live in Bloemfontein, you could live in Kuruman, you could live anywhere in South Africa, and you will have access to a bank, an insurance company, a telco, which is an MTN or Vodacom or SLC, or a host of retailers, ShopRite, Checkers, Spar, etc. Now, unless you're a really lazy person, which a lot of people tend to be, unfortunately, there's no excuse to not come up with something creative that can be of benefit to either a retailer, a bank, a telco, an insurer, a manufacturer, or a big media company. I forgot to mention media companies. So I'd say banking, insurance, telcos, retail, media, and to a lesser extent, manufacturing, right? So you got to understand a very important concept in scaling, which again, you'll never learn in business school, is you have two choices. You can be a big fish in a small pond, or you can be a small fish in a big pond. And when it comes to increasing the size of your target market, one of the only ways you can do that in South Africa or in most countries in Africa is if you sacrifice margin for volume. I'm going to repeat this because it's super important. You need to be able to sacrifice margin for volume. And how do you sacrifice margin? You create something that is of value to a large corporate, and you share your revenue with them, or you charge them a license fee, or you build a solution for them where the customer sees the corporate, but the corporate pays you a per user, a per transaction, or a subscription fee. No one needs to know that Sanlam's peer-to-peer insurance policy or program for millennials is actually built by a startup in, I don't know, Barberton, in Mpumalanga. No one bloody cares. I almost used the F word, but I forgot I was on YouTube, right? So that's how you scale smart, not hard, right? You build something that someone can distribute for you, and then you reduce the cost of acquiring a customer to almost zero, right? And once you do that, you have incredible power, because you then aren't locked into exclusivity agreements, and you can build stuff from multiple insurers, from multiple retailers, etc. And then you have all the power. And then once you have 100,000 users or 1 million users, guess what you can do? You can now approach them directly, but you don't have that leverage until you have a critical mass of users. And that's what corporate South Africa is there for. So yeah, that's how you go and become a king in a small town, by working with the right distribution partners. But yeah, that's.
All right, thank you. And I think that's the kind of information that, it should be more and more into the ears of, these small towns. I was just flabbergasted most recently when a friend of mine moved from Cape Town to Port Elizabeth and said, there is no space for professionals to engage on matters pertaining to professionals in the entire city. And that was scary.
Yeah,
because
I have stories of people doing business on Tinder because there was no other place that they could find like-minded professionals.
Like business on Tinder, So it's actually like an interesting phenomenon to think about. We speak about coachability of our entrepreneurs, and the fact that one has got to be able to balance, what they know and how they've always done things, and what the possibilities are. I'd like to talk to the possibilities when it comes to the kind of funding instruments that we have. Our financial institutions tend to not be too flexible in terms of introducing, and then there's regulation, of course, and all sorts of things. But you also have people who all look alike, who've all been doing things the same way, who've learned from other people who are like them. And so very little innovation comes out of our financial institutions when it comes to, I guess, even identifying the opportunity to fund innovation, let alone implement it in their own spaces. I'd like to have a conversation and hear from you. Maybe we can start with you, Jorge, and Zach, you can also provide input as to what are the opportunities for innovating within, financial services, or not necessarily the institutions that we've all grown up, getting money from, but what are the opportunities for innovating, given that we sit with a lot of inequality, for example. In our country, we know that the kind of education that everybody's receiving is very different, let alone the difference in the quality of the education that people are receiving. So we know that the current systems aren't necessarily serving the potential pipeline. So I'd like to hear from you. What changes do you think can be introduced? What kind of innovations can be introduced? Today I read about a slow fund, where
Nick Columbus's fund, 1,000 rand. Yep.
1,000 rand a day and 30 minutes of coaching. Yeah. Like that for me is innovation. That for me is trying to reach the masses. Please, I'd like to hand it over to you to just hear what your thoughts are around, if not actual funds, but what kind of principles could be introduced into the system to not only look for innovative solutions to other problems, but innovative solutions to funding.
Jorge, you want to go?
Maybe you go first.
Sure, no, for sure. Yeah, listen, I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, if you're not innovating on the funding side, you're a dinosaur, you're a gorilla, whatever you want to call it. So I think so if you think of the first innovations in the startup and funding space, in 2005, yes, Y Combinator launched something called Y Combinator is one of the world's largest, best accelerators. They created companies like Airbnb, Stripe, Dropbox, etc., Instacart, etc. They created something called a safe note, which is a simple agreement for future equity, which is essentially a convertible note that does not have leverage and has no fixed maturity. On average, even to raise a small financing round of, let's say, $500,000, entrepreneurs would have to pay lawyers shitloads of money and waste so much time to get term sheets. And then Y Combinator said, why are we, as an accelerator for entrepreneurs, not lessening the roadblocks and bottlenecks? We will create a security that makes it easy for investors to invest into companies and defer pricing to future rounds, either through a valuation cap or a discount. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of it now, but so there's innovation that needs to that needs to happen on the legal front. And I gave you a good example of that. There's innovation that needs to happen with suppliers and procurers. For example, why aren't enough entrepreneurs going and approaching their suppliers for supply finance? Why aren't they having their clients prepay for goods and services? Why do you have to keep going around with a handout asking for money when you really can be using your clients and suppliers? It's called vertical integration of your supply chain, right? Why aren't people doing that? Again, there's no excuse for lack of innovation. It's just convenient to make excuses because you just can't do it, right? So that's why I say to a lot of people, the smartest entrepreneurs in Africa tend to come from regions where there's nada, zilch government help. So you have to innovate. If you go and spend one day of your life in Lagos, you'll know why entrepreneurs are sitting in cafes, not sipping, soy chow lattes with oat milk and stevia sugar. They're out there coding and building the next app or the next platform for anything, right? And because they know that Lagos has 25 million people, there's never going to be a shortage of total addressable market for them to do stuff. So you need to be able to not have this mindset of being given to. So that innovation needs to come from within the private sector. It needs to come from schools and universities. So what are universities in South Africa doing to encourage not just their graduates, but even people from the outside to co-create and build for future, for future benefit. Just I'll say one last quick thing. Universities also, again, I hope this is not sponsored by some university, but universities also tend to have really big issues with holding on to IP. So you can have someone build an incredible product that they cannot commercialize because the university has a stronghold on IP. So there needs to be IP reform on how the creators of something can share in that in more commercially favorable ways. So you need to create a way in which entrepreneurs are incentivized to do what they do best, which is innovate, without the fear of not having the money to innovate and not having things like IP control to prevent them from doing so. So listen, I can speak about this for 2 hours, but I'm going to stop here.
In fact, that's a big thing. I think, Leslie, you've probably gone and evoked her now because, that's a big thing in our space. We are a university-based incubator, and that conversation around universities holding on to IP is a major one. And we're constantly looking and trying to find innovative ways of being able to circumvent that because it does stifle innovation. And, just this morning, she was talking about how within the university space, inventions stay inventions. They don't become innovation because they don't get commercialized. They don't start generating revenue, and they don't get rolled out. And it's such a loss to the country, I think, as a whole. And I think this would have been a good conversation for Phemelo from TIA to also hear, because they do a lot of joint investment with the universities. Jorge, I don't know if you have anything to add to the previous question, but I know I did have a question for you. But maybe you can add to just the issues around.
To that one in terms of innovation. I'm actually, I just have it here. It just happens that I have this book here, 0 to 1.
One of my favorite books of all time.
I can highly recommend it. And we're talking about innovation now, right? So basically, what they explain here, I don't know if you guys can see, I wasn't prepared for this, but now maybe you can't see it. So basically what they explain is you do have 2 ways to innovate. So you could do like in a horizontal way, tweak things and make it work better. Or you could just go vertical and basically do something that no one has done before, right? You do create a lot of value in that, in terms of innovation, when you do that vertical intensive progress in terms of creating something that has never been done. Obviously, it's way more difficult because no one has done it before, is not proven yet, right? So and the other thing you can do is just adapt the what you know already that is working somewhere else, just adapt it to whatever ecosystem you live in, right? I think in terms of funding, basically, our fund works a bit different because of the social impact fact. The investors and the LPs have a different expectations on ROIs and on timelines as well. So obviously it works a bit different on terms of like patient capital, but we do use basically the same instruments. And one of the meetings and discussions was actually about like what kind of instruments do we want to use, and the discussion is around like, well, let's use a safe, let's use a KISS, let's use whatever it's outside there that they've been using in Silicon Valley. And now the question is, shouldn't we first go to Africa and understand what are the needs exactly, and can we just tweak this, or can we create something completely different? And I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of that because of the same difference that we're talking about. So you can't scale a company as easy as you scale it in the US. You can't do that so easily in Africa, for example. Abu was just talking about that revenue-based investment. We also read about that just probably 3-4 weeks ago. It's one of the things we're thinking about and analyzing how this could work in the African ecosystem. So yeah, I think there's a lot of space for improvement and for creating new things in terms of innovating from the funding side. Also, one point I would like to do is it has some sort of fake glamour now, the fact of raising huge rounds of capital, and a lot of founders and entrepreneurs think that's a cool thing to do, you know, and to say, oh, I've raised 10 million, 20 million, 100 million. That actually shouldn't be the case. It's actually those entrepreneurs living in small villages with very limited access to capital who are able to create a solution. Those are the best ones, and not the ones raising millions and millions.
Thank you so much. We've actually jumped into our Q&A time, and we only have 5 minutes to delve with our Q&A. And I think as we just quickly jump over to some of the questions that have been raised, thank you to everybody who's watching on KTN's YouTube, as well as Tshimologong's Facebook pages, and for the questions that you have brought in. Maybe, Zach, you can quickly respond to us as to how does somebody get incorporated in the UK? That's a South African company. That's one question that came through. And then another question that came through is around the point you made around entrepreneurs thinking about volume. Do you think that our accelerators and incubators are thinking enough or supporting enough entrepreneurs to think in that way? And you can possibly answer what they could be doing to support that a little bit more. And then Hoho, maybe you can just I don't know, speak to the question that came in from Hudus. He's asking the question around and I guess he creates the context in South Africa and Nigeria, where he's asking about funds being possibly repositioned, being repositioned to healthcare or biotechnology since COVID, and how possible that is, or whether or not that's an opportunity. Zach, I'm going to hand over to you first.
Yeah, and I'll take that. Regarding the first question about how, I mean, the first question is a no-brainer. You can incorporate a company in the US or the UK very easily. You don't even need to be physically resident there as long as you have an address. And there are lots of companies that, you know, who provide this as a service. They will have a physical office with the residents, and you can set up a company in the US. And as long as you have one local director present, and there are people who create a business as a service to create local directors. So that's not an excuse. You could, I can give you a couple of links. I'll put it in the chat here so everyone can see it. Firstbase.io is a good resource where you can set up a company in Delaware without having to physically be there, open a bank account, etc. I think the one exception is you can't do it if you're doing unsecured lending or borrowing. Then it becomes a little tricky. But also remember, the US banking system is a lot more adaptable to small businesses and tech startups. So banks like Silicon Valley Bank, Mercury Bank, are way more advanced. I mean, I'm sure everyone here knows about the proliferation of digital banks all across the world. So that's one. The second question you asked me was about accelerators and incubators and how they can help with the volume thing. I mean, like, I ran one of the largest accelerators in Africa called Startup Bootcamp for 4 years, or co-ran it, sorry. And our whole sort of mission was, if you don't have the potential to work with, like I mentioned earlier, big corporates from a distribution standpoint, I'm sorry, you wouldn't get in. And we make no bones about it. We say, if you're a B2C business that's trying to sell something to a consumer directly, unless, you know, your last name is Rockefeller or Morgan, just double check what your last name is just in case you don't have it. It's very hard to reach customers. You need a lot of money to do marketing from B2C. So from day dot, I've always been a fan of B2B businesses or B2B2C businesses, where you are able to leverage off of distribution channels. So to get into an accelerator like ours, or similar, you know, ones like Plug and Play or Techstars or Founders Factory, etc., you need to be able to convince you know, the accelerator teams that you've got a very high target addressable market, TAM, a serviceable addressable market, and then a niche within that is your beachhead customer. If you don't get that off the bat, you won't even get into an accelerator. And then once you're in the accelerator, you get a lot of help and support from organizations like Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, all the big accounting firms, all the big law firms. They want to work with you because they know that you've got the right business model and metrics, and what you now need is professional services, so that you can focus on doing what you do best, which is reaching out to your customers and solve their problems. So those would be sort of the two responses I would give to your to those questions.
Thank you. That's very important, and I think the point that you make around professional services, like late stage guys, they just want to get out there, do their thing. What they need is the support with those large legal or accounting fees that they'd have to pay in order to get the work done.
I mean, and that works also. Sorry, just a quick thing. Is that works also for early stage guys. You cannot send someone an invoice for 2,000 Rand an hour to give you legal advice if you're a startup. So legal firms and accounting firms and need to understand long-term versus short-term. So, yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much for that, Jorge. And I think the question is possibly thinking also within the context of impact investing, and then I think we'll come to a close.
I think if we talk about repositioning venture capital, I know there's a lot of opportunities in different sectors. In our personal or like institutional criteria, we've decided to focus on those two, right? So renewable energies and agri-tech. But I do think, and just remember that you have the big venture capital companies. They kind of jump early on the new trends, but a lot of the other capital firms around, they kind of follow trends, right? So you had fintech, for example. It's a big thing in Africa, and then you start seeing a lot of players coming to play into that area, fintech, right? I think definitely healthcare or medtech or technology around health, it is a huge opportunity. And then as soon as you have a few players in there, if that's the trend, then capital is going to come towards that same trend. So biotechnology, I don't know that much. I know it's capital intensive. So you do need a lot of money and a lot of years to come up with a solution. But that's what I can say in terms of repositioning capital.
And I guess, it's always a moving target, right? It will never be one thing at a time. So, for example, we know that fintech attracted so much in investment last year as a result of COVID. But, we have reached the end of this really lovely conversation. I could just continue, and it was really great. Education of life. Those are some of the things that I've picked up, is that every day is an opportunity to learn, and your degree, the school you went to, is no indicator of your success in life. And I think our country is showing us that we cannot measure success the way we used to measure. I think, Zach, you picked up on financial as well as non-financial metrics in evaluating entrepreneurs, but also in evaluating companies, and how that becomes a key issue when considering that life is not black and white. And so we need to be able to measure and find metrics to measure the gray in between. I enjoyed this conversation where we spoke to what makes an entrepreneur. We spoke to what makes a great team, because we do know that without the people, there is no company. But of course, the company has to be able to show innovation. And we spoke to, what that innovation looks like from a product perspective. But I think we had a great conversation talking about the potential innovation when it comes to funding as well, because we do know that funding is the lifeblood of many conversations. Zach and Jorge, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you so much for educating us. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. This is exciting. I don't think it's a mistake that Africa is having this conversation. It's also not a mistake that Africa is where the opportunity is, that the world just needs to be able to see. At least the world is starting to see now. Thank you so much to KTN Global Alliance Africa for creating the platform. Thank you to Tshimologong for being open to having this conversation. These are constant questions we're asking ourselves within the precinct, and we're constantly looking for opportunities to engage, learn, and then implement on the learning, because it's pointless us having this conversation, right, just for the sake of having a conversation. Thank you for the discourse. Thank you for the time. To everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and thank you for your great questions. From me, Kwezi Tsenenda, from Tshimologong, this is it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.